his family has been here a long, long time. Ken left for a while, but he's back, and we're certainly glad. So, and he'll tell you more about himself as he goes on.
I'm going to tell him more about you.
So go ahead, Ken.
Well, I'd like to thank Diana for asking me to do this, because it was something I needed to do, and I told her it was like trying to put together a long-term paper, because you can just keep adding to it, and it doesn't end. And there's more families, more stories, more kids, and and it'll be something that we weren't in the Meade County book for some reason. My father wasn't, so I've done a lot of research and trying to put an addendum in there on his behalf, so for my kids. And I've got a couple of those books that I'm going to give to my kids. I'd like to thank Richard Moeller. He's a great computer whiz, and he's really done a lot of help putting the slideshow together for us. And we've got new pastors in our church, in the Lutheran church, that are here. Kevin Jensen and his wife, Pastor Carla Nelson, and they both give a great service.
Is that a plug?
We're not going to talk about it. Oh, and Bonnie Lang. Bonnie Lang used to deliver mail out of our place, and about the time we farmed east of Sturgis, and about the time we were in the process of going broke out there, she was delivering mail. So I didn't like the mailman, because she always brought more bills than we had money. So, and then I tried to research some of this information as best I could. Some of the stories were told to me when I was little, and they were told to the people that I heard them from when they were small. So some of the dates and names may not correspond with some of the memories of the people in here. I've tried not to embellish them or exaggerate them, but I might inject some of my own thoughts at times. It's easy to remember the negative things about families, but I don't remember much that wasn't good and positive about my family. I may get sidetracked on a story from time to time. My wife told me, you're going to need to shut up from time to time. So, and it's pretty hard to condense 4 generations and many families into 1 hour talk. But we've been pretty normal, and we don't have any notorious criminals or jailbirds in our family that I know of yet. I guess there's a possibility. I'd like to introduce some of my family. I'll start over here with Dana, granddaughter, beautiful girl on the end over here. And Carolyn is our office manager for our business. Next to her, my wife Jeannie, sitting there in the black sweater. My oldest son Eric and his wife Raina. Going back, my Aunt Helen, my mother's sister, Helen Thomas, there she is here, and then her daughter Diane. Helen's been around probably longer than anybody else in the room, I think.
95.
So, and then good friends Arleth McFarland, their family were good friends down on Eltrick. Carol Aga and the Sigmunds. The Agas were instrumental in the first church here, the Lutheran church here in Sturgis. So, and then the next row back is Amanda Beug, is my brother's daughter. Rhonda, Annie, my brother Ron, Amy, and in the back row I've got my daughter Chris. Chris lives here in Sturgis and is taking care of a disabled great-granddaughter. Next to her is Noah, my grandson. He works with us in the business. And Sana, his friend. And then there's little August. Hi, August. And Cameron. Cameron is Sana's little boy. I love little Cameron. Sana and Sana's family immigrated from Cuba years ago, and she was born in Los Angeles, I believe. And Her last name was Castro, can you imagine that? So, anyway, that's, the other thing is the Beugs weren't the only families to move into this area and settle. There were a lot of great families out here that all deserve credit for developing the area in the agricultural world. A lot of them came from different countries, different backgrounds, different families. But being from a farm family, I'm most familiar with the families in the Bear Butte Valley and the Alkali Divide, east of Sturgis. On Alkali, the Grubels, Keflers, Thompsons, Hardys, Kettelsons, Augas, and Mollers come to mind. And in the Bear Butte Valley, the Bichons, Brooks, Keflers, Cheneys, Johnsons, Matkins, Dupros, Lanfers, and Carlses, plus many other families, were all successful in farming and raising great families, and all of them went through very hard times during the Depression and 2 world wars and long periods of drought and blizzards. The names that come to mind in Sturgis, when I was a little guy, were Archie Haley and his family, who had a grocery store, the Bennings, who had a store next to my grandparents. My grandparents had a house right across from the Knuckle, where the senior center parking lot is now, and Bennings would have been the next building to the south. The Lush Baws, Anderson and Stingleys, the Jollies, and Harold and Bruce Walker of the Bear Butte Bank. Harold Moko was a John Deere dealer who lived kitty corner across the street from Eric, my grandfather. And all of those families had great adventures and experiences and are quite notable for their accomplishments in that period of time. We had a reunion this summer, a Beug reunion, and had about 80 people registered, including a gentleman by the name of Karsten and his wife Rosie, who came from Germany. And they're both well-traveled. They've been all over the world several times. So, getting back into the Beug name, and here's some dates and names. In 1718, Klaus Boyen, B-O-Y-E-N, married Maria Milsbach. In 1733, their son Klaus Beug, B-O-G, was born. From 1780 up until now, the spelling of the name has stayed pretty much the same, although the pronunciation's been different. My uncles Bud and Dan Beug pronounced it Bike, B-I-K-E. We had a second cousin that moved to Denver, and when he moved to Denver, it was hard for people to figure it out, so he called it Beug. I ran into an old German in Montana one time that I'd given him a check for gas, and he looked at my check, and I thought, God, I don't have enough cash to pay him if he doesn't take my check. And he finally said, well, if you were in Germany, they'd call it Beug. So it makes a big difference on the dialect and the language as to how it's pronounced. Most of those pronunciations are probably better than what I've been called at times. My great-grandfather, Ferdinand Beug, who I never knew, came over from Germany. He was born in 1847 in Jarmshagen, Germany. He was baptized and confirmed in a Lutheran church, and he met his wife Johanna Buschka, who was the daughter of a weave master, and also from Jarmshagen, Germany. I think that's how you pronounce it. At age 37, he and Johanna, the daughter of a weave master, and one of Ferdinand's brothers, Karl, who were sons of Christian Beug, came over from Greifswald, Germany. And that's where Karsten, the guy that was here this summer, still lives. And that was in about 1884. He was 37 years old. He homesteaded back at Lane, which is between Woonsocket and Wessington. He homesteaded on the 2nd of May in 1885, and on May 3rd, the next day, he married Johanna. So they apparently couldn't get married in Germany for whatever reason. I don't think the economy was very good in Germany at that time. My great-grandfather settled near Lane, which is back closer probably to Woonsocket. The family kind of lost track of some of the other brothers, although there is a Beug, or used to be a Beug up in Moorhead that had a Beug hardware store. And I think one of them went out towards Seattle. Ferdinand farmed and also had a general store in the Lane area, I believe. I heard that he helped other German immigrants to settle and helped with provisions and working with land titles with the Germans that came over and followed. And it was a big German community at that time. In 1910, Ferdinand was listed as paying a tax or something. I couldn't read it because the German colony back there was so big that they had a newspaper that was written in German. So I think that, I'm not sure of this, but I believe he was one of the founding members of the church in Lane at that time. I don't know if I got.
Yep.
And my brother Ron and I were there a couple of years ago, and that's what the church looks like today. I think it probably has some great stained glass windows in there, but it's been abandoned for quite a while. My great-grandfather was friends with a guy by the name of Feisner, who was a pastor there for a while. And both my great-grandparents are buried in the Feisner Cemetery, which is a little cemetery south of Lane. It's got about 50 people in it. It was on the Feisner farm. Ferdinand, and this picture was taken in 1805, and Ferdinand's the old guy in the middle. My grandfather, Eric Beug, is the tall one in the center, and then Alfred, his brother, to the left of Eric, and Emil. And both Alfred and Emil followed Eric out here when he came out to Homestead. And the two sisters, Elma and Martha. And Johanna died in 1905, I believe. And so this picture was probably taken shortly after the funeral. The story that I heard that was told to me by my Uncle Bud was that Eric was so upset that his mother had died. She died in childbirth. And the story was that there was a blizzard. It was too hard to get a doctor or a midwife to her. The other story that I heard was that Ferdinand was just too tight and didn't want to pay anybody. But anyway, those kids were probably pretty upset about it. The story I heard was that Eric was 16 at the time. However, in this picture, in 1905 census, Eric was still listed as living in Lane. So he didn't come over here at 16. He might have been out here in this area before that, but he didn't leave Lane until after his mother died in 1905. This is a picture of Eric and my grandmother Levi when they were married. My dad was born in 1914, Daniel, the second boy, and there's a picture of him over here somewhere. When Eric left the Lane area to come out here and homestead, he ended up homesteading out on 4 Mile Creek, which was about 4 miles north of the volunteer store, and right close to the Dale Lundgren farm up there. There were about a dozen families within about a 3 or 4 mile area out there. They had a school, and they also had Eric built a dance hall out there. But his brothers followed him out, and they homesteaded in the same area. And right now it's the Lundgren Ranch and basically pasture, because there's not many other people left out in that area. They all had to leave. Anyway, Eric homesteaded out there, and they farmed, they raised sheep, and he picked that area because the Ormond Dam irrigation project was supposed to extend to the area, but it ended up not going that far east and on the north side of the river. It's called 4 Mile because that was the name of the creek where he homesteaded about 4 miles north of the volunteer store. he built a machine shed in 1920, I guess, and then he put a dance floor in that was removable and could be put up against the walls when machinery was put in the building. And they had community dances out there. His brother, Alfred, talked about cranking a 5-gallon ice cream maker for treats and dances. And this was during the time of Prohibition, so I think they probably had other things available for refreshments, knowing my grandfather, other than ice cream and lemonade. He probably charged something to get into the dances. The boys worked with their dad Eric on the farms, and Eric rented or owned, and they also did many odd jobs in their youth. In the 40s, they were all involved in the family farm operation on Alkali, producing wheat and cattle. The one brother, Emil, had left and gone back to Tennessee. Alfred was still out here, and he eventually left the place on 4 Mile. Times weren't real good out there. Eric had borrowed money from either Clem Carls or possibly the old Hank Brook at some point. And then Eric dried out. The sheep, they had hailstorms and drought to contend with. And so he had to sell all these sheep, and he turned the property over to Clem because he couldn't pay Clem back the money that he owed. And today the property is owned by John Brook, who inherited it from Carl's. Eric at that time had decided he would go to California, but he didn't have the money to pay the bank for his loans and go to California too. But he ran into his banker, Herman Walker, from the Bear Butte Bank on the street before he was ready to leave, and Herman asked him if he was going to California. And Herman told him if you would come in and pay the bank for the loan for the sheep and operating, that he wouldn't have to worry about being able to borrow money again because it would always be available. When Eric left 4 Mile out there, or possibly before that time, he and a guy by the name of Henry Martins was on the plow there in the back. I think Eric was probably on the left side on the back of the tractor. But they farmed together in a partnership, and they broke up a lot of sod, a lot of prairie. And then they also did custom harvesting. Lost my notes here when I was... Anyway, Eric went on to become quite prominent in agriculture and bought a place east of Sturgis and farmed out there through the 40s. Sometime in the 40s, and I used to have a picture or a copy of the newspaper article. He was named Farmer of the Year, and I'm not sure if that was in western South Dakota or in South Dakota, but he couldn't go to the ceremony because he had too much to do. But he and the boys produced a huge amount of grain and livestock at that period of time. And before the 40s, during the Depression, I think it was in 37 or 38, they collected a lot of scrap iron and loaded it on rail cars. That would have been in 38 before the war, and shipped it to Minneapolis. And I think I asked Bud one time, my uncle, what happened to all the old steam tractors and old equipment in the country, and he said, well, they broke it all up and sold it, so it was gone. So there wasn't a lot of it left in this country. And one of the reasons they were so successful in the wheat business was that Dan and his sons, Dan and my dad, Ben, had gone out to Seattle or Oregon and Washington and had seen summerfall practices out there. And summerfall is where you leave the land fallow for a year, keep the weeds off from it, and conserve the moisture. And you plant it back to wheat, then winter wheat the following fall, and you don't get a crop. So you only get a crop every other year. But they broke up about 800 acres east of the place out there at Alkali. And the first year after summerfall, they got at 50 bushel to the acre. And at $2 a bushel at that time and 20-cent gas, they had to pay for. That was a huge amount of money. And so they did quite well with the wheat thing, and that continued for quite a while. And then other farmers in the area picked up on that practice, so it became quite a common practice. And Eric had bought several places along Alkali and consolidated them. He had some ground over on the 9 Mile Road towards Vale. He had a couple quarters over there. And later in life, he ended up buying a place from a guy by the name of Dalzell out east of Elm Springs. I'm not sure how big that place was, but he traded Dalzell, gave Dalzell some money and then a house in town in order to get the place. Harold Moko, the guy that was the John Deere dealership, had the John Deere dealership here in Sturgis, ended up farming the place and eventually bought it from my granddad. So, Helen, if I make any mistakes on these dates and stuff, let me know.
Gee, you're good, you're good.
Ken, that tractor almost looks like a steam.
Yeah, it was a steam tractor. That was I think that was a Frick steam tractor.
Okay.
And that would have been one of the earlier tractors, because that was clear back in 1918.
That's
18
great.
or 19.
That's just a great photo.
And then later, he and Martin ended their partnership, and Eric bought a Reeves tractor and had a threshing machine and a big threshing crew, and he worked up and down Bear Butte Valley and over around Vale threshing and doing custom farming for people. He and the boys broke up a lot of ground out at east of Castle Rock, which is way north of Newell. So they covered a lot of country with their tractors. At that time, they had when they were breaking that ground up, they had Caterpillar tractors, I think, and they broke it up for a guy by the name of Paul Schumer. And Paul, eventually, he was an old guy, my grandfather's age, and he eventually rented it out to Jerry Geringer's family, and they farmed it for years. I don't know if the Geringers are still out there or not.
No, they're not.
Oh, aren't they? Eric was kind of, they had a problem out there. In 1948, there was a big hailstorm that went from east of Sturgis out through Alpha, and he was listed in the Rapid City paper as being one of the biggest wheat farmers in western South Dakota, and they had done an interview with him to see, what kind of losses he had on the farm. And at that time, he hadn't yet been out there, so he thought probably 50%, but, it was hard to tell because he hadn't looked at it yet. Eric was always called, his sons started calling him the old man. He didn't want to be called the old man, so he told him to call me the old gentleman. Well, they settled on the old gent. And the old gent was kind of the name that kind of picked up on, or everybody kind of picked up on. Ellen Moeller was telling me they had a fire out there on that place. They bought the Nichols place, I believe it was, and it was a lightning caused fire that went through there and burned a bunch of buildings on one of the places they bought, plus the wheat crop, plus a lot of grain that was in a granary. So not all times were good out there. Alfred Beug, his brother, ended up he bought a place down here off Pleasant Valley exit on the west side, and they called it the Bulldog Ranch. And it would be his granddaughter, Kathy Smith, and her daughter are still taking care of the original house down there. However, Elma, one of his daughters, bought part of it, and so he still has, descendants living there. I'm going to go into the Alfred Beug family, and he was Eric's younger brother. He married a school teacher out on 4 Mile, Ethel Henwood, and they had 3 children, Elma, Arlo, and Milo. Alfred eventually bought the place here west of the interstate. Elma recently passed away. She was married to Fred Hartman. They had a drive-in restaurant in Kokomo, Indiana for years. They had 2 children, Effie and Kirk Hartman, And Kirk lives out on the place yet. He spent a lot of time working in Wyoming. And Elma and Fred are both pilots, and they flew quite often from Kokomo to South Dakota. They were eventually divorced, and she and her second husband, Kurt Carlson, ran the Big Bear restaurant in Boulder Canyon for a while. Effie married Dale Johnson from the Johnson family north of Sturgis, the Kenneth Johnson family, and she still lives out there in the place. Dale's passed away. And they were longtime members of the Lutheran Church. So Elma ended up in the Aspen, living here in Sturgis, and Gina and I went up and saw her quite often.
Are there two plows there?
Pardon me?
In that picture there, are there two plows there?
Well, it looks like it, doesn't it? Yeah, I don't know. It looks like they have two of
Looks
them in
like
Canada.
corn planters, maybe.
You know how many bottoms are on them?
Pardon me?
You know how many bottoms there are?
Oh.
Going forward.
I counted
Again.
5 or 6.
Yeah, 5 or 6 bottoms on there. 1, 2, 3. Probably 6 bottoms, so that was and it looks like they're turning them pretty deep.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Pretty powerful tractor, that breaking sod that big.
Yeah.
yeah. Alfred had three children. It was Elma, Milo Beug, and who was the other one? Anyway, Milo, the one daughter, I really never knew. She married a guy who was a doctor in Texas. Milo, Alfred's son, had a upholstery shop here in Sturgis for a while, and then he moved to Denver and had a carpentry and decorating shop down in Denver. It was down on South Broadway. And Milo, Alfred's son, and his wife Norma had 4 children: Johnny, Kathy, Stanley, or 5. Kathy, Stanley, Mary, and Josie. Johnny is a veterinarian he's still alive. He's a veterinarian in Red Lodge, Montana, and he specialized in working with horses and large animals, and was just recently named Veterinary of the Year in Montana. Kathy Beug Smith, and she goes by Kathy Smith, and her daughter still maintain the house out here at Alfred's place. She studied the Native Indian culture for years, and Jeannie and I were in the Custer Battlefield Museum one time when we were visiting it, and she was in the museum there, looking at some of the exhibits. I think she was living on the reservation at that time. But she went on to help Kevin Costner in the production of Dances with Wolves, and help pick the sites for the movie production out east of Sturgis and up in Spearfish Canyon. She made a lot of costuming for the movies, including the wedding dress and a lot of the military costumes. Jeannie and I, when we lived in Colorado, went to Santa Fe and saw that wedding dress in the window of an art gallery down there. And we do work for the Kevin Costner Tatanka up here at Deadwood. And I tried to find the dress and get it donated up there, because they've also got some of Kathy's military costumes that she made up there. But it had been given to the lady that wore it in the movie. Kathy went on to win an Emmy Award for costuming in the movie Son of Morning Star. It was a movie about Custer. She currently has a studio in Taos and was recently inducted into the Cowboy Hall of Fame. So did very well in her professional life. Her personal life wasn't quite that good, I think. Stanley, the younger son, worked for the railroad in Colorado, and he looks a lot like Buffalo Bill. I've seen pictures of him in parades acting the part. Mary married a young man that had a ranch family near Lowbridge, and Josie, the youngest daughter, has a small animal clinic and is a veterinarian in Florida. Arlo is the other daughter of Alfred, and I never met her. My mother visited her several times. So I'm going to try try to get into the thing about family history is that you can't talk about the old guys without talking about the grandmothers. And quite often the grandmothers and great-grandmothers have huge influence on the kids, probably more than the men at times. Grandma Strayer, Glee's mother, was born in 1870 in Ferris Center, Michigan, and had 4 daughters, Glee, Fern, Fred, and twins Pearl and Opal. And there's a picture of her, what did I have on here? That's a picture of Grandma Strayer when she was disabled. She was working in Albuquerque and came down with something called pernicious anemia and lost the ability to walk. And so she was they had her in a hospital, Lutheran hospital they called it, in Hot Springs. And she was in there for 6.5 years, but never got over it. So back up here again. One of her daughters, Glee, married my grandfather, and another one of her daughters, Fern, married one of the Follets over at Vale. Then she had 2 twins. Her husband, Elmer Strayer, my great-grandfather, I never knew. He had a stroke when he was very young and was partially disabled. She also, great-grandma Strayer, also took in a little girl named Annie, who was brought to him to take care of for a couple of days at 3 months of age. But her father had lost his wife, and he never came back to get her. So they raised Annie up until she got married here in Sturgis. Strayer eventually homesteaded east of Vale, but he continued to do a lot of carpentry and was credited with building several homes in the area. And some of this came out of the Vale Sodbusters and Cowboys book that I got over there. She's also worked as a cook and nutritionist, and I heard that she worked in the Poor Farm, Diana Hayes' house that she had up here. She worked there as a cook and nutritionist for a while. Then from there, she went down to the School of Mines, and when it was first started, then worked as a cook nutritionist down there. And she and the girls, the twins, lived in the boiler room in the basement. And the twin girls, Pearl and Opal, ended up getting married. They married to engineers. One of them went to Omaha, I think, and the other one was down in Albuquerque. And that was kind of before my time. I'd met them one time, and I was probably 10 years old or 12. So. And she also had, Kate Soldad did a picture of, or a nice article on Grandma Strayer, and the timeline is kind of messed up. I don't know what the timeline is, but for a while she was a nurse, and she said that was before you had to have an R in front of it as a registered nurse. But she had a maternity home here in Sturgis, and her specialty was babies. I'm not sure what period of time that was in, but then after that, she ended up in California and worked as a nurse out there in several places, and then went back to Albuquerque where she got sick because that's where her daughter was. Grandma Glee, my dad's mother, lived here in Sturgis, and she was a painter. She painted, picture of my dad, she painted pictures of all the kids, and she copied a lot of paintings, as most artists do. She had several paintings of the garden and Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And she had painted the picture called The Horse Fair. And Bud and Dan both she painted 2 copies of that. When I was a kid, I had no idea what the story behind The Horse Fair was. But Gene and I, when we lived in Denver, we took Amtrak out to New York, and we were going through the Museum of Art out there, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and went up into the European section. And the first hallway I walked down, that picture was at the end of the hallway.
Interesting.
And it's huge, and that's the picture to the side there is me beside the picture. It was 8 by 16 feet long, so it was a huge picture. And Rosa von Hoer painted the picture. It was painted in 1852 to 1855 in Paris. And Rosa was a pretty famous female artist, and she had a reputation for painting animals. And that was at a period of time when women weren't supposed to be artists in Europe. And she went to the horse fair quite often to, study the animals, study the people. And she had to get permission to wear men's pants, men's clothing, because it was illegal for women to wear men's clothing at that period of time. So she had to get permission from the police in order to go to the horse fair dressed as a man so she could paint. And there's a white horse right in the middle of the picture, and the woman or the person that's on the horse behind that is her self-portrait. So really, really an interesting story. That picture toured all over Europe and was eventually purchased by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1887 and donated to the museum. He paid $53,000 for it, and that would be $1.6 to $2 million today, in today's money. And she also painted several pictures of Christ in the garden. And that was a famous picture that came out about that period of time. It was painted by Heinrich Hoffmann in Germany and purchased by John D. Rockefeller in 1832 and donated to the Riverside Church in New York. So my grandmother not only painted, but she knew art history. And then she also had a patent on dolls, and I'm not sure what the patent involved, but she made a lot of dolls and sold quite a few of them. Lee told me that when she was a little girl, she knew Poker Alice and knew where Poker Alice lived and her notorious house down there. And so occasionally Lee would go down there and hang around the house, and Poker Alice would come out and give her money just to go away. So Glee suffered from really severe migraine headaches all of her life, and up until the point that Eric died, and then she didn't have any more. So, I don't know if that says something about the relationship. So, but they were able to. They traveled to Washington and they toured some art galleries when he was alive, and they also traveled to the Southwest. And in 1950, they took a trip to Cuba when there was still gambling going on down there. It was a really hot place for gambling at that time. And I remember my parents talking about Lee being upset when they came back because apparently he left her in the hospital or in the hotel and went out and gambled and browsed around, and she was not happy with him. So I spent a lot of time with my uncles Bud and Dan Beug, and my brother told me one time, he said that was the only way we could really get to know our dad, because our dad passed away when I was 9. He was 41, and so we really didn't, either one of us, have much of a knowledge of what kind of a guy he was. I'm Bud endorsed by, see if I can find the picture here without messing this up. Well, that's another article on Glee Beug and her paintings that was in the Sturgis paper. Bud Beug and Doris Beug were married on February 14th, 1943, on Valentine's Day. April, the oldest, was born in 44, and Martin was born in 47. They farmed and ranched on the Beug farm on Alpha after Eric retired. Bud had built a lot of buildings out there and did a lot of work on the place, but a few years ago here, after he had passed, a tornado went through there and took a lot of them out of there. So. Bud, because his dad had been involved in the steam tractors, Bud and Doris bought a Case 1911 steam tractor, and then the tractor they were farming with at that time was a Case 1200. diesel tractor. And they were both very instrumental in starting the antique show out here. And somebody asked Bud about it one time, and he said, well, we didn't start by ourselves. It was a community effort in order to get the steam show going. And Bud was also on the whole family went to the Grace Lutheran Church, where it sits now, but in the old building. And Bud was on the building committee for the new church. And I attended I was working for him in the summertime, and I attended the dedication of that church when it was dedicated. So I remember must have been 120 degrees and it was horrible hot. So I wasn't sure I wanted to go to that church after I went go in there and sweat all morning. So Martin, after high school, he joined the service, but he was discharged because of a car wreck injury. And the story about Martin, when I was working for Bud in the summertime, driving tractor, quite often Martin and I would be on the same field on different tractors. One afternoon, there was a cloud that came over, and a bolt of that high, dry lightning came out of it and struck in the field on the other side of the hill where Martin was working. So I lifted up my equipment and ran the tractor over to the other side of the hill to see if I could find Martin, and no Martin. Pretty soon he crawled out from under the tractor, and I've never seen anybody so white. The lucky boy. He should have been dead. And I think he got a little charge through the steering wheel, he told me, but it didn't hurt him. And later he was hauling grain to Sturgis, and the Alkali Road goes by the old airport there. There's kind of a curve, and in order to approach the airport, planes had to come over that highway. And he was going by there one day, and a plane hit the back corner of the cab on his truck with a tire.
Whoa.
If it had been up just a few inches further up, it would have hit him right in the head. But, so he survived that one too. And then he helped start the Historical Society here because he had access to a lot of Bud's articles and things that Bud had saved over the years. So he married Rita Myrose, and they had two daughters, Megan and Jenny. April, his sister, graduated from the University of Wyoming and married Erwin Stoner, and they lived in Sturgis. They had two daughters, Michelle, who was born in Italy when Stoney was in the service, and Marie. Stoney worked at the VA Fort Meade and retired from there. Dan Beug, my father's brother, married Evelyn Bachand, whose family lived in the Bear Butte Valley. I'm not sure when they got married. They had four sons, LeVere, Jerry, Harvey, and Dennis. And Eric had purchased the Hardy place from Ayers in 1944, and Dan bought it from Eric shortly thereafter. They had Dan had a large wheat farm out there. He added and rented quite a bit of ground. Dan always, I would stop out and see Dan quite often and visit with him, and he always worried about not having enough education. I think I don't know if he even finished the 8th grade, but he seemed to mention it quite often. However, he had bought a tractor that used to pull bombers down at Rapid City at the air base down there, and remodeled the tractor. It was a Euclid, and remodeled it into a farm tractor, put tires on it, went through the transmission, knew the gearing, and he showed me a schedule that he had of how much horsepower it had and what the ground speed would be in the various gears. So that took a lot of math in order to figure that out when he changed all the tires and everything on it. And that was before he took it out of the shop after he rebuilt it. And it had a 671 GM motor in it, which is a huge motor. And you could hear that thing for miles when he was running. Kind of a side story on his place out there. I've got an article here on, let's see if I can find it. That's Dan Beug and Evelyn when they were married. Their four sons. LeVere is in Oregon. He left out shortly after high school. He went to Brookings for a year or two, and he went out to Oregon and worked out there. Harvey is still on the place, and Jerry lives out there yet. Jerry was in the service, and then he was also in the National Guard, and he was down in Panama at one time. Dennis went to the School of Mines. Dennis graduated from the School of Mines as an engineer and worked for I think it was the munitions portion of the Army down in Columbus, Ohio, and retired from there. Short story about Dan's place out there. Just north of Dan's place in the Meade County book, they refer to a guy by the name of Louis St. Croix of dubious character. And one of my nieces sent me an article, and Louis St. Croix was a chicken thief. And so he sold hundreds of chickens to the food establishments in Sturgis. However, Louis didn't raise chickens. So he was stealing chickens from all the neighbors out there. And they finally ran out of chickens and figured out who it was, and Louis moved and left. So, okay, now to my dad. Am I boring everybody and taking too long here? My dad and my grandmother painted a picture of him there. He and Edith, my mother, were married in 1943, right after she got out of high school. And there's a marriage certificate there beside him. My mother was a Baldwin. She was from the Vail area. And Aunt Helen back here was her sister. So they grew up together. Buster Baldwin, Buck Baldwin they called him, was my grandfather. My great-grandfather, Thomas Baldwin, I might have a picture of that here. I'll back up a little bit. This is a copy of my dad's baptismal certificate, and I've got the big copy over here. It's all in German, and except for the names, which you can read. I don't know German. And then the house next to that was on the Louis Malik's farm. My dad bought that probably just a little before Mom and Dad were married, I think. That was the Louis Malik's house, and it was remodeled, and it's still in use today. My granddad, great-grandfather, P.J. Baldwin, was also had an old steamer and did custom farming over on the Vail area. And he tried going across the Belfouche River and found a hole out there, and it took him a week to get it out of there. So it was in the river there quite a while, and that's a copy of it, or a picture of his Tom Baldwin's threshing crew, and that came out of the Vail book. Those books are amazing that people went to the effort to put those together, and some of the stories in there are just incredible. So all the people in this area went through a lot of different things. I'm going to back up here again. I'm going to talk a lot about my dad because he didn't show up in the book. My aunt called me up, and we'd just been married. I was 9 when my dad died, but Gene and I hadn't been married very long, and we were farming, and I was going to school and one thing and another. And my aunt called me up and asked me to write a story about the Beug family. Well, I really didn't know what she wanted it for, so I didn't get around to it. And so when the book came out, the Meade County book, there was nothing in there about my dad and mother and our side of the family. So my father, Ben Beug, was the oldest of the 3 boys that Eric and Glee had. He was born out 4 Mile. Baptismal certificate, he was born in 14, and the baptismal certificate at Lane, South Dakota was in 1915. So apparently they went back to the old church in Lane, and that's where he was baptized. He worked with his dad, Eric, on the farm. They did custom farming and threshing, and they were involved in a partnership on Alkali Divide east of Sturgis. In early 1940s, he purchased the farm. He left the partnership, I think, and purchased a place 3 miles north of the community of Beug on Highway 34, which is 12 miles east of Sturgis. I think it was purchased from Louis Malick's family, who had gone broke during the Depression, and it was probably heirs that he bought it from. He paid $7 an acre for the land, including the old house. And there were very few, if any, outbuildings at that time. There were 1,760 acres in the original farm, but my dad sold 160 acres to the Tennis family who lived east of us, that bordered the south side of their farm. He broke up the ground and raised winter wheat and small grains. We had a few cattle. He had a total of about 900 acres of cropland. And then he also rented another 320 acres from his dad, Eric Beug, who had land over on 9 Mile. He never stopped building, creating. Built a lot of buildings out there, built a shop and a Ponce. I remember coming home from school one day, and there was all this wood in the little dugout dam we have in the little house. And he was soaking the wood in there so that he could bend it into an archway to build the Ponce. And the Ponce still stands out there. One winter, I was probably 8 or 9. Probably 8. He built a fishing boat in his garage. And another story, he took me up to Deerfield Lake the next summer to fish. And he had a small motor on it, and we trolled for trout. We both had the same kind of lures, but his was a different color than mine. And he was catching fish like crazy, and I wasn't catching anything. So he let me use his lure, and then things switched. I caught a lot of fish, and he didn't catch anything. But he wanted me to learn how to use the oars on the boat, so we were in a little bay there on the north side of the lake, and he pushed me out into the lake by myself with the oars, and I had to learn how to row in order to get back. So it worked pretty well. He used to have at the garage where he built the boat. He also was kind of a community gathering place, and they had poker games out there, and he had a sign above the garage that said poker night, or what was it, bank night, it said bank night on it. And so Duperels and Comuses and a lot of people would gather there and play poker, and some of the people from Sturgis would show up out there, Jack Oshino and
The walkers,
pardon?
probably the walkers.
Yeah, probably, they were out there at times. So, anyway, and he did let me drive his tractor. He had an international tractor that I drove when I was probably 8 years old. Or no, I would have been just 9. And that was sold at the auction after he passed away. Edith, my mother, attended school in Sturgis, and I think she graduated in 43, about the time just before they were married. And she graduated as valedictorian of the class. I don't know how big the class was, but I found a picture of her at History Days, who had all the albums from the schools. Guy Edwards had a collection of school class books, and I found her picture in one of those. So, I was born on May 15th, 45 in Deadwood. My brother Ron was born in Deadwood on May 19th, or December 19th of 51. And Ron got his middle name from Dr. Joseph Ham, who was the family doctor for most of the family. And Ben always called him Little Joe. Dr. Ham also delivered most of our children up at Deadwood. Ron Beug family back here. Ron had ended up with a big family. Jeremy Sampson married Amanda. Ben Carls, Amanda. And Jeremy works at home in computer stuff. Amanda's a real estate agent up at Belfouche. Matt Carls and Amy Carls, who's back here, were married, and Matt has Matt's Barber Shop here in town. Then there's John, James, Lexi Carls, Joss Carls, Madison Carls, Annie Shaw, who's back here. Annie married one of the Shaw boys from out of White Owl. And Annie just recently bought the old White Owl store and remodeled it into a kind of a boutique, and there's a beauty store in there, a really nice store, great Western clothing. And she just recently had a big showing down at the stock show here in Rapid. Her brother Ron rode the bike, Katie Shaw and Kylie Shaw and boys, and then Gavin Elora, were Joseph bikes, and where's Gavin? He's got a couple of other kids that aren't in there, but Joseph lives down at Hot Springs. Ron, after my father passed away, then Ron and my mother my mother remarried in the Lutheran church, and her husband got transferred to Colorado Springs with the Forest Service, and so Ron went to school in Colorado Springs and then down at Woodland Park, and he married Rhonda, who was from Woodland Park down there. And they ended up moving back up to Sturgis, and they had a small shop called Country Creations, and it was in the Beug building, which is where Hot Leathers is today. That building was sold, Ron sold it, and was eventually torn down, but then they bought from Flowers by Rose from Keith and Sue Kepler and moved it into the house across from Kincaid's. Ron's always been a high-end woodworker, and I call him a high-end woodworker and an artisan most of his working life. He's done a lot of wood stocks and for collectible shotguns for Galzan and Connecticut Arms, and a lot of those guns are in the $10,000 to $20,000 range, so they were great gun stocks. And they've also been really involved in the church, the Presbyterian church up on Avalanche Road, and he and Rhonda were founding members of that church. And when they built a new church up there, he made the entry doors and the archways for the new church, both inside and out from scratch, and much of the other woodwork also in the church. I think he did a lot of woodwork over here in the Catholic church, didn't you, Ron?
Yeah, I spent quite a bit of time over there.
So whenever we have company, that's on our list of touristy things to do. We go up and show those doors off. So, the first movie I went to was when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I went with my grandma Glee. The movie was Walt Disney. It was an animated Bambi that had come out early. And as a little kid, I was really amazed at the movie. It was in the Majestic Theater. That would have probably been in 50, maybe 51. But in 1951, my dad purchased the old Majestic Theater across from the post office and remodeled the building into office and retail locations. And it was then the location of Davis Barber Shop, B's Beauty Shop. State's Attorney Bill Kocher had an office upstairs, and quite a few other tenants, for years. Ron inherited the building and then eventually sold it, and it was turned into a Hot Leathers, rebuilt and turned into Hot Leathers. My dad had a rheumatic fever when he was little, and it affected his heart valves. And he and my mother had taken a trip to Baltimore in the early 50s because that was apparently the best heart facility in the country at that time. He passed away in February of 55 from a massive heart attack, going up the stairs to the federal building, which is now the post office in Deadwood. He was going to an IRS audit for an interview, apparently, because according to friends and relatives, it said in the obituary he was going up to pay his taxes. There might have been a little more to the story than that, because I think he was really getting harassed. A lot of people were upset when he passed away up there. The funeral was held in the Grace Lutheran Church, where everybody was, most of the Beug families were members. And he was buried in the Beug Youth Cemetery on a cold and nasty winter February day. I always felt that he would have wanted people to have, that he would not have wanted people to attend the funeral on a nice day, because they probably had better things to do. My mother had an auction that was held by Francis Haley about a month later, because it was necessary to get the farm sold before spring planting. And she then purchased a house from Francis Haley at 1443 4th Street, first address I had to remember. And we moved into town. Janice Reinhardt, her picture isn't in this. The photos are out there. She's over here in one of these pictures. Janice Reinhardt boarded with us when I was in the 6th grade, and I finished the 6th grade in Country Meyer School. Janet drove back and forth from Sturgis. She moved into town with us. The picture that's up is, I think that was my 2nd grade teacher. It was Mrs. Richardson was a teacher. And she lived in a little screened off area in the back of the church, or the back of the school. And then Irene Castile. Irene Castile was the 2nd one. Then the Murray's the 1st one on the left, Irene, and then Willie Comus, and who was the cousin to Diane Comus back here. And then I'm the taller one in there. The other picture is just a picture of some of the kids in the school at that time. And that's what the school looks like today. So a little bit dated. Looked pretty good back then in those original pictures.
Yeah.
Oh, I used to be a little skinnier. This is when I was 17 and a senior in Custer. And that article is written by Don Linder. And I think Don was here, or has been in here, hasn't he? I think I met him. But anyway, we had beaten, we were the smallest A team in the state, and we beat the Cobblers. They only had one school in Rapid at that time, it was Cobblers. But then we went to the state tournament, and we ended up taking 3rd, but we were playing against schools like Brookings and Sioux Falls, Washington. So we only had 50 kids in our graduating class. After my dad died, she decided I needed to learn how to get along with other kids and be in a little bigger school than we were in. So she went to the teacher's college up in Spearfish to try to get some secretarial skills and put me in summer school up there. And so I was in the school up there. These kids kept asking me, well, what grade did you fail? And I didn't remember failing anything. But apparently they had a summer school for kids, a lot of kids in various schools that they had to attend in order to go on to the next grade. So when I got to school here in Sturgis in the 7th grade, I knew a lot of the kids. Not a lot of them, but some of them anyway, some of the characters. After I graduated from high school, my parents had moved, my stepdad and my mom moved to Colorado Springs, and I went to school in Sheridan, Wyoming on a basketball scholarship. In spring of '64, April 11th, I married my little high school sweetheart, Jeannie over here.
It's a long date that he put up.
I thought I changed it here. So anyway, well, I'll get back at you. So anyway, when I married her, I thought she'd grow up. But she didn't. She stayed short. But you know what? It doesn't make a bit of difference when you've got a big personality like she did. Anyway, and then after I got married, then I attended Brookings and went through what they called an agricultural short course over there. Basically ag programs and ag management and training. And then after that, I went to a semester in Spearfish, and there again, it was, I took mostly business courses and that type of thing. Jeannie and I had 5 kids. See if I got them. In this picture, on the top back row, it's Chris, who's back here. She takes care of a disabled daughter, Melissa, who's a registered nurse in Denver. Brian, my youngest son. And then on the lower level is Jeannie and our oldest daughter, Jane, who's a teacher in Denver, or Commerce City right now. And then Eric, my oldest son, who's right here in the middle, next to his mother. We farmed out there for about 18 years, but the first year we got 10 bushel of wheat per acre at 56-pound wheat, which was really low. And so there wasn't near enough to pay the bills, and we should have taken that as a hint probably. But we stayed out there for 18 years. And at one point in time in 1971 and 72, I worked with her dad up on the reservation, and I had a couple of ready-mix trucks, and we poured cement for Indian out for a couple hundred Indian houses up in that area. So then after that contract ended, I sprayed a lot of crops out east of Sturgis. And eventually we sold the place. In 1982, we had $2 wheat and $2.30 a gallon of fuel, and combined with 18 to 20% interest, we had to sell the farm and move on. A lot of people in that period of time, all over, a lot of people ended up with financial troubles and had to leave. So it wasn't an uncommon thing. I worked insurance and real estate for about 2 years in Sturgis and Rapid City, and we moved to Rapid Valley, and haven't been there very long. And I'm sitting outside on the step in front of the house, and here comes this guy walking up the street. And I thought, I have no money. I'm not buying anything from you. And his name was Roger. I don't know his last name. But our eyes met, and I couldn't just get up and turn around and walk away from him. Roger was a missionary trying to set up a church for the Lutheran Church in Rapid City. It's a Lord of Life church in Rapid Valley. And so Jeannie and I ended up being charter members of that church. And my oldest son, Eric, was confirmed in that church.
I think it's Roger Lundeen.
Pardon me?
Roger Lundeen.
Yeah, okay, yeah. How'd you know that?
He was in Newell.
Oh, okay.
He'd been pastor in Newell before he did that.
Oh, okay. I couldn't remember his name.
Yeah.
And then, but we ended up moving to Rapid, or to Colorado before the new church was built. And I had to come up to the Lutheran church here and borrow a bunch of the banners they used to have in the church, and took them down there for decoration. We met in the schoolhouse down there in the probably the cafeteria, and had set up chairs and hang banners, every Sunday. But then Gene and I moved to Colorado, and I worked with a company down there called Orkin, a pest control company, and as in sales and service, and eventually an assistant manager, and then left Orkin, and helped the guy start another company called Bug Busters, and I worked there for about 8 months. Then I left Bug Busters, and Jeannie and I started bargain exterminating down in Denver. And we did anywhere from 80 to 100 restaurants on a monthly basis, plus a lot of homes and that type of thing. When we were in Denver, we were blessed with the caretaking of the Kaz kids, we call them. And the little guy on the left is Andrew. The one on the top is Zach, and Kayla is the little girl on the side, on top. The little white-eyed little boy on the bottom is Noah, who's back here. And Noah came to us when he was about 13 or 14. And I think he and his mother decided that Sturgis was a better place to grow up than what Denver was at that point in time in his life. The little girl in the middle, Ashley, is my oldest daughter's daughter. And she has given us 4 great-grandchildren. So they're all these kids are a lot older than they were then. This is just a certificate that my great-grandfather had. Oh, there's a Chicken Thief Louie article. So, and it's interesting in that article, apparently there was a gang out there. They said the South had Jesse James, but Alkali in the early days also had a band of outlaws. And that's kind of an interesting article. I've got the name over here. So, we ended up decided that we didn't want to raise the Cavs kids, Kayla, Andrew, and Zach in Denver. So we sold our business and looked at other business opportunities. And we made a trip to, I don't have any pictures in here of that, but we made a trip to Honduras. My oldest daughter had married a boy from Honduras that came up here when he was 16 and got deported a couple times. But he ended up marrying her, and he's a citizen now. But we went to Honduras and beautiful country. They lived right in the central part of the country, and his family was from the central part of the country, and a lot of tall pine trees. It looks an awful lot like the hills, only the mountains are bigger. But a lot of tall pine trees with pineapple and various oranges, lemons, grapefruit, coffee, cane, sugar cane, just a great variety of stuff that grows intermingled with a lot of that stuff down there. But so we took a trip down there and we hired a guy by the name of Luis Vega as an interpreter. And the first morning out, after we stayed in a hotel downtown near the downtown square, and Luis showed up, and so we started touring. And the first morning out, we went to a place, my son-in-law's mother's house, and there was a little girl sitting there, a pretty little Honduran girl sitting there with a chicken in her lap. So anyway, where's Rena? So I asked our interpreter, I said, well, what is her story? And she said, well, she's a single mom. And so I told him, I said, well, tell him I've got a son that needs a wife. And so he did. And again, I didn't think much more of it. But a couple years later, Rena came to us, and she had a daughter, Myra. They both got their citizenship, and Myra's a registered nurse now that works out at Fort Meade. She graduated from Sturgis High School. And then Dana, the beautiful girl in the end, showed up. And then Myra made us a great grandparents. She's got a little, Rena's daughter has a little girl. So I'm talking about great grandparents. There's a little boy in the back. Cam. Hi. I think you'd make a great grandson. Great grandson. Anyway, that's not my choice to make. But so I love the little guy. So anyway, that's kind of the story of my family. I investigated several business opportunities down there, but the government in Honduras is probably about as corrupt as ours is. And Gene and I were down there at one time, and they had they called it a revolution going on, and it wasn't too serious. They were burning tires in the road and stuff. We didn't see anybody get shot or anything. Anyway, we were riding with my son-in-law, and the police stopped us along the road. And I don't speak Spanish, so my son-in-law's babbling at him. And he said, so after we left, I asked my daughter, who speaks fluent Spanish, what did he just say? And he told him that he was taking an American dignitary to the embassy. So I'm glad they didn't ask for any identification because it wouldn't have worked. So, but anyway, getting off on a different topic, I haven't been to too many of these. I went to Charles Rambo's talk on the KKK. And he gave a great history on the KKK, and apparently my grandfather at that period of time was asked to join the KKK. While he was doing custom harvesting throughout Vail and in the Bear Butte Valley, and he said no, he wasn't interested in an organization like that because a lot of his friends that he worked for, and his customers lived up and down Bear Butte Valley and on Alpha and over around Vail, so no, he didn't join. And I think at that time the KKK was mostly Protestants against, or Catholics against Protestants, one or the other. My Uncle Bud told me when he was a small boy that, and we heard this from a lady the other day on the Methodist Church talk, that the KKK used to have dances and have their cross burning on Sly Hill. And so my Uncle Bud told me he was out watching the cross burning one night, and all of a sudden these guys they got the cross burning, they're gathering around the cross up there, and all of a sudden you start hearing rifle shots go off across Sturgis. And the KKK didn't have any more dances on Sly Hill. They moved it. Now that might be a story. I think it's probably true. But so if anybody's got different versions, I'd sure like to hear them. So, as far as war stories and people being involved in the war, from my family, Eric's brother Alfred served in World War I in Germany with the American Army, and I think he transported munitions and was also an ambulance driver for a while. He showed me a helmet he had from World War I that had a crease in it, apparently from a bullet. And I'm not sure how long he served, but apparently he got sick and was pulled from the front lines. World War I was a horrible time in Europe. There were 8,500,000 soldiers died from artillery fire, small arms, and gas, and a total of 17.5 million, which included civilians that were displaced or died of exposure or starvation or mass murder. Al Rubidoux, a friend of mine, has a picture of a plaque that was in front of the old Presbyterian Church on Junction, and I talked to him the other day. He was asking me if I knew what happened to the plaque, and on that plaque it listed a total of 28 men from Meade County who died in that war. 14 of them died in France, and another 14 died of wounds and probably sickness. And considering the population of the county at that time, that was a lot of young guys. And he's also got a book that was published in 1919, and it lists hundreds of guys from this area, in the Black Hills area, that went over in various divisions. So Al's quite a historian, and if he's got a lot of old books and stuff. If anybody's interested in history, he's a good guy to talk to. And if anybody knows where that plaque went, that would really be a neat thing to have, because it disappeared after the church was torn down and remodeled. My grandfather, Buck Palmer, on my mother's side, had a brother that was in World War I. We called him Uncle Bill. And Uncle Bill had a large scar down the middle of his nose, but as far as I know, he never worked after the war. They said that I asked, what happened to him, what he was doing, and I was told that he'd been shell shocked. And he usually lived with his mother, my great-grandmother Baldwin, as long as I remembered him. In World War II, we had a family reunion at Dan Beug's house in Alpha in the 60s, and Heinz Beug, who was a relative and son of Otto Beug and direct descendant from Germany, was able to attend. At that time, he lived on the East German side, and all they'd let him out with was bare minimum for clothes. He had to have a sponsor for all his transportation and basic needs. He was in the German army in World War II, and he served as an anti-aircraft gunner. He was captured near the end of the war and spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in England. We had a distant cousin, Bill, who also served in the Air Force during the war and flew many missions into Germany. And Heinz was an anti-aircraft gunner on the German side. And when they got together and got to talking, after Heinz was out of the room, the cousin Bill said that the stupid Germans would always shoot at the shaft, which was a radar deterrent every time they flew over. So I thought that was kind of funny. We got one cousin shooting at another one during the war. But Heinz was eventually captured and spent 3 years in a prison camp, and a lot of it I think he spent in England. Elma Beug, one of Alfred's daughters, married a guy by the name of Fred Hartman. And Fred served in World War II as a pilot in the Army Air Corps. And he was shot down and captured and spent 9 months as a German prisoner. And the story that I heard about him the other day was, as the Germans started to liberate as the Russians started to liberate the German territories, the Germans would march the prisoners to a different location. And this happened a couple times with Fred, but he was finally able to escape by hiding in a pile of bodies, and he got left behind. The German guards kicked at all the bodies, but apparently missed him, and he and several others were able to get up after the Germans left and escape and go to the friendly side. In the Korean War, I remember listening to the news on the radio about the Korean War and wondering if my dad would have to go. And I would have been, probably 5 or 6 at that time. And the KOTA evening radio news came on about the same time as Boston Blackie and the Lone Ranger, which I always listened to. So I remember, and I also remember KOTA as having the Roy Rogers song, Happy Trails to You, as their theme song for either signing off or on the air. When Vietnam started, my cousin Davey ended up going to Vietnam, and I think he got 2 Purple Hearts over there, didn't he? I got a draft notice in 1965 when I just started farming, had a wife and a daughter, and so I got this questionnaire from the Custer Draft Board, and so I filled it out with all the good reasons I didn't think I should be drafted. And they wrote back and they wanted a doctor's statement on how tall I was, so I went in and got measured by Dr. Ham, and he said a statement to the draft board. And at 6'7", they determined I was too tall to go into the service at that time. So I was physically unfit to go into the service. I think it had to do with clothing, or maybe it might have been an easy target or something. But anyway, I wasn't really disappointed. But I later felt guilty that I hadn't paid more attention to the war, because I had friends and classmates and a cousin, Davey, that did go. Martin Beug, Irwin Stoner April's husband, and Jerry Beug all served about that time, but none of them ended up in Vietnam. A few words of wisdom from the Beugs, and these are basically just stories. My Uncle Bud told me that women have the hardest time in life, and I think that my great-grandmother Strayer probably did. My grandmother Strayer, in the article that was written by Kate Soldat, said that sometimes women are a woman's worst enemy, and when people cease saying good things about you, that anything about anybody, it's time to move. And that might have been why she ended up in California. And I'm not sure what was going on in her life at that time. My grandma Glee, one of her things that I remember, said that sometimes people with great talents don't get to use them because they're too busy trying to make a living for their families. And she had great talent, but she still managed to use it. My grandfather Eric wasn't very sympathetic towards people with self-created problems. And I mentioned to him one day that sometimes people had to learn by experience. His reply to me was that only the dumb ones had to learn by experience. And I kind of really stuck with him. In the 60s, there was a lot of talk about there not being enough food to feed the people in the world, and I asked Eric what he thought. He said there's always a market, and farmers would grow to furnish the food for whatever the market was. But in many areas where the food was needed, they didn't have the money or the transportation to get it to the people that needed it most. And he said if it was a severe problem, that the governments would just start another war, and that would get rid of a lot of population. And having lived through 2 world wars, I'm sure that he was probably right, because they got rid of a lot of population. story my Uncle Bud told me. Bud had had major heart surgery and had a lot of complications afterwards with staph infection. And they had to go in and remove part of his sternum, and it never quite healed up, so when he turned it, the sternum kind of went like that. And so I asked him if he'd had any problems with depression after that, because a lot of people did when they had major heart surgery. And he told me, he said, it's kind of like looking down a muddy country road. No place you need to go, and if you go down that road, you're just going to get stuck. And it would be very difficult to get out and back to where you started. So don't go down any muddy roads in life, because it's pointless, and that road will just get you stuck. So, anyway, Bud was always really cautious about furniture, around equipment, extremely cautious. And in order to impress me one time when I was working out there for him, he picked up a stick and put it in a belt pulley on a columbine so I could see how quickly it would snap off a hand or finger. And it was ironic that later, when he was in Sturgis, he had a snowblower and managed to stick his finger in there too far and got his finger mangled. My brother Ron and Rhonda and Jeannie and I took him to the emergency room in Rapid during a blizzard where no travel was advised, and he ended up losing one finger. But Marla Kincaid told him that he'd had a 2-second dumb attack because he certainly wouldn't do that under normal circumstances. And for me, I guess, little kids are like puppy dogs. They just kind of show up at your doorstep and you gotta love them and take care of them. So that's kind of the end of my story.
Anybody got any questions you'd like to ask Ken?
What year were you married again?
Don't you want to know what year you were married?
Oh, yeah. It was about 80 years ago.
Anything else?
Nope, I guess that's
Ken, well, Ken, thank you so much. On behalf of Sturgis Area Arts Council, here's a little gift of our appreciation.
okay. Well, I hope I didn't bore everybody too bad.
It was great. It was great.